being Chinese, they couldn't speak to the local Europeans who were gold mining. And because they look so different, they ate different foods. They said, oh, we don't want you to live in our towns. You have to live out in the outskirts. So you have a tent. And we don't want you to work on our gold fields either, because they're reserved for us. So they worked on the fringe of the gold fields, and where Europeans abandoned what they said was unworkable fields, the Chinese would move in, rework them. And then they found more gold. And the Europeans said, well, that's not good enough. We don't like that either. So they were victimised. Their tents got vandalised. Larrikins set fire to them. The huts got raided. And Chinese got picked on the gold fields.
The first Chinese to reach as far inland as here in Naseby arrived in 1867. Actually, that very first guy wasn't even looking for gold. He'd come up here looking for a place where he could establish a market garden. He didn't have much English, and unfortunately he was set upon in the main street here by a group of local thugs. They grabbed hold of him, they cut off his queue, his pigtail, they put him in a barrel, and they rolled him up and down the main street. A horrific experience which led to the poor fellow having to go into the Seacliff Mental Asylum in Dunedin. He was so traumatised by his experience and actually died soon afterwards. Now, there was quite a strong official response to that and a number of other incidents that have been taking place here in the late 1860s. The Otago Provincial Government Superintendent James McAndrew put out a proclamation in which he restated those commitments to the Chinese that they would be welcome here, they would receive official protection and given the same sort of treatment as Europeans. But despite that official level promise of fair treatment, there was nothing really that could be done on the ground where you had individuals who wanted to express their hostility to the Chinese and petty harassment. So it was a sign that in the years ahead, things weren't going to be so straightforward and it would not be all wine and roses for the Chinese here in Otago.
It is correct that there was an upsurge because the Chinese didn't change, and in their earlier period they were well tolerated. After all, they were invited here and regarded as an asset. But round about 1879, several things happened. Circumstances changed. For one thing, the service gold was becoming quite noticeably diminished, and the European miners began to regard the Chinese as competitors. Secondly, there was no other work or significantly diminished amounts of other work because of the long depression which occurred between 1879 and 96.
So the scars on the landscape of the old hog-burn diggings are now softened by the Naseby forest which grow over top, but you can still see it in areas like this. And the Naseby area, hog-burn diggings, are part of the Mount Ida goldfields. One of the things about Mount Ida was the high proportion of Irishmen who lived up here, and they were really at the bottom of the heap with the Chinese and competitors with them for labouring jobs, things like constructing water races, labouring tasks on the farms. And when things began to get a bit tougher in Otago, particularly the end of the 1870s as the Great Depression hit and lasted for quite a long time, that competition for labouring jobs became pretty fierce. And the Irish were particularly worried about the Chinese, an alien group who were likely to undercut them and work for cheaper rates. And that sort of competition at the bottom of the heap really doesn't help communal relations, and there was a fair bit of tension between those groups in particular. Personalities can make all the difference. Critical periods in the late 19th century, those in political power in New Zealand determined the framework within which the Chinese had to operate. So for instance, you had a premier like George Grey who was deeply racist, incredibly hostile to the Chinese, succeeded a little bit later by Richard John Seddon, exactly the same. So poll taxes were instituted, they were increased, limitations were placed on the number of Chinese who come on a ship, a reading test was imposed later on for Chinese wanting to come to New Zealand. And all that framework really made things harder and harder for the Chinese. But it was true at a lower level too. So who was in charge of a particular district in terms of the police, the judiciary, the gold wardens. That could really determine how favourable an environment was to Chinese gold seekers as well. And sometimes things were pretty rosy. Different people would come in, they could really turn on the Chinese. So it was kind of variable. And at a lower level again, in communities, institutions like the local newspaper could really alter the way people thought about Chinese. And behind me we have the offices of the Mount Ida Chronicle, one of those goldfields newspapers from up here in Naseby. And for a period in the late 1870s, this newspaper poured forth the most vicious, racist bile against the Chinese and really made this neighbourhood very hostile to their presence. So the official response to incidents of Chinese persecution in places like Naseby was to move the Chinese constable, John Alou, a man who had a lot of experience obviously in Australia, who had a high capacity in spoken and written English, and who had a European wife, so very much integrated into both the European and the Chinese community, and a hinge point between the two groups, just like Louis Gaetan, also up here in Naseby for a time. So those men and others like them, with that language capacity, with that familiarity with both sides of the cultural divide, were so important in maintaining relationships on an even keel between the two of them. Not just here at Naseby, John Alou also served at other spots around the Otago goldfields, and there were other constables like him as well, but a pivotal role. Despite the appointment of Chinese constables, the Chinese remained targets for abuse. During the early 1870s, acts of violence involving Chinese were rare. One notable brawl at Tinker's signalled alarm for the Chinese. This is John Mellor, my great-great-grandfather's hotel, the Newtown Hotel at Tinker's. Now Tinker's is now called Matakanui, but back in 1872, it was a pretty thriving little settlement with a number of hotels, a number of stores, a number of butchers and so on. That was the year in which thousands of Chinese had come in here on the gold-seeking trail. And some of the storekeepers around here, not my great-great-grandfather, but a butcher, thought they'd try it on with some of these newly arrived Chinese. So one Sunday in fact, in 1872 in February, a local butcher tried to short sell some meat to one of the Chinese. It was supposed to be 50 pounds of pork, but it was only about 30 or so. Now the Chinese guy wasn't silly. He went back to his camp, thought this isn't 50 pounds of pork, weighed it, realised he'd been diddled, and came storming back with some of his mates to confront the butcher. Now tempers were frayed, voices were raised, shovels were carried, and an all-in brawl developed. The Tinker's Affray it was called by the newspaper. There were some casualties. One of the Chinese guys was quite seriously hit in the head with a shovel, big cut, laid him out. The butcher did all right, but one of his bystanders was also laid out by one of the Chinese with a shovel. So arrests were made. A court case followed. Now it was a pretty messy sort of business, and the policeman coming along trying to sort it out basically made a representative arrest. One European, one Chinese. In the sequel in court a couple of months later, the charges were serious. Assault, attempted murder. The fates of the accused, however, were quite different. It was a jury trial, and the jury found the European, although this case against him sounded pretty solid if you read the newspaper, they found him not guilty. He got off scot-free effectively. The Chinese guy, on the other hand, he was given a sentence with hard labour being found guilty. Now the lesson for that, for the Chinese, was despite the official assurances of equal treatment, that they would be equal before the law, when it came to the crunch, and down to a jury of 12 good men and true, a Chinaman would not face the same fate as a European. So they learnt that they would have to be forbearing. And that's a real Cantonese virtue, to put up with things. And that was the way ahead. When things got tough and they had to put up with petty discrimination, they just kept their head down and took it. And in the long haul, they earned a lot of respect for that. But in the short term, it meant they really had to put up with a fair bit of rubbish. The Tinker's Affray was not as serious as the Lambing Flat riots in New South Wales, which saw nearly 300 Chinese injured. But it was a landmark case for the Chinese in Otago. Despite affirmations, they now knew the justice system could not always be trusted to be fair. Another case that highlighted this happened at nearby St Bathans. And when we consider the interplay between European and Chinese in 19th century Otago, it's tempting to see it as a question of goodies and baddies, mean-spirited Europeans picking on the poor old Chinese, and generally speaking that's pretty accurate. However, there are some stories that counter that, and we get a bit of the tones of grey and, you know, rascals on both sides. And here in St Bathans, we could tell a story about a rascally Chinese thief named Qin Our Chow, who one night was caught red-handed stealing from the property of the big cheese around here, Lan Yuan, the mining magnate who really pioneered hydraulic sluicing around here, introduced iron pipes to sluicing. The Blue Lake really is a testimony to his prodigious efforts as a miner over many years. And in 1871, when Qin Our Chow was brought to his tent, tied up, Yuan exploded in a rage, came out of his tent, pulled a pistol and shot him in the chest. Now fortunately, Qin Our Chow survived that, and Yuan immediately regretted his act and provided medical care for him. They both were tried for their respective acts of criminality. Qin Our Chow, of course, was sent to jail for a while, and so was Yuan. However, such was his influence and esteem in the community that a petition with 2,000 signatures was put before the courts, such that his sentence was reduced from 18 months to just 4 months.
In comparison with California and Australia at the same period, many of these harassments may seem minor, but there were several very sinister acts towards Chinese in which lives were lost. The best known of these stories was set deep in the Roxbury Gorge near Doctor's Point.
In the 1880s, things turned nasty in Otago for the Chinese. A level of resentment against them had built up, a growing sense of anti-Chinese feeling, and that was expressed throughout society with, you know, casual comments, nasty sort of statements. Children would play tricks on the Chinese. Larrikins, delinquent youths, would play worse tricks. They'd throw stones, they would catch Chinamen, they'd cut off their braided plait of hair, the queue that was characteristic of Chinese in that period. Sometimes it would go even further than that. In 1883, for instance, in an isolated spot like this on the banks of the Clutha, a little cave dwelling like this built into the side of the hill, a pair of old friends, Ah Chin and Wah Ki, gathered together one night for a feast. They had a roast duck. Inside Ah Chin's little cave hut, he had all sorts of delicacies, and they were feasting up, drinking spirits. Wah Ki got a bit sleepy, lay down. Ah Chin started to smoke his opium pipe, and then all of a sudden, a shotgun was poked through the sacking at the entrance and discharged, with fatal consequences for Ah Chin. He was mortally wounded. Wah Ki was lucky. None of the pellets hit him. He took off, went to get help. By the time it arrived, it was too late for Ah Chin. Now, the police did investigate. They tried to find out who had done it, but no one had any information. It was an isolated spot. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The gun couldn't be traced, and ultimately no one was found responsible. And it's one of those incidents that are typical of the discrimination and oppression facing the Chinese at this period, but unlike many of the incidents which were much more low level, this one had fatal consequences for poor old Ah Chin. In the 1890s, Alexandra became the centre of hostility towards the Chinese. Now, that had been prompted perhaps by the growing numbers of Chinese in the main township of Alexandra. They had boarding houses there in which Chinese gambled, smoked opium. They even had European prostitutes coming up from Dunedin to consort with the men. They were quite boisterous and quite loud, and they offended the sensibilities of other citizens in the town. But leading that anti-Chinese feeling was a Swedish-born dredge master who operated just up the river from where I am here at Doctor's Point in the 1890s. John Magnus was his name. Now, he hated the Chinese. He'd spent some time in Shanghai as a policeman in the European protectorate there and had come away with a real loathing for the Chinese and their culture. He brought that with him to New Zealand. And in Alexandra, he wasn't slow to draw together his men, his mates, and in really thuggish behaviour, they attacked Chinese premises, they harassed Chinese, they cut their queues off, generally made their life a misery. But things got even worse in October 1895, when a man named Qin Our Chow came down from the Serpentine goldfield where he'd been very successful. He had over 300 pounds of hard-won gold money, and he was on his way back to Guangdong. He stopped off, left the money with his brother in Alexandra, and he went around the district to try and recover some debts that other Chinese owed him before he went home. And he disappeared. Now, his brother posted a £25 reward for any information about what had happened to his brother Quang. And Magnus and his thuggish mates decided to play a prank. They dressed up parts of a sheep and a goat, and they dressed it up with clothes, and they made a fake corpse, attached a Chinese coup to the back of it, made it look very realistic, and dumped it in the river. Now, when it was found, everyone thought it was Quang. The police rushed to the site, the body was lifted out, put on the back of a cart, and taken all the way back to town. Everyone's sure that it really was the body of the lost Chinaman. Of course, when the doctors came to perform the inquest and cut into the body, they immediately discovered it was a fake, and Magnus and his mates outside erupted with laughter. They thought it was a fantastic joke, this hoax they'd perpetrated, and the story was retailed all around the district, and over the years, it's come out again. But the dark reality is that Quang was probably murdered and his body was never found. It's quite likely that Magnus and his mates were involved. But whatever, the upshot is that Quang's family back in China never got to see him again. And the prank of the lost Chinaman is actually a cloaking device for the murder of a poor and innocent man here on the banks of the Clutha. So here in Roxbury Cemetery we confront again some Chinese graves on the edge of the cemetery, perhaps outside an original fence line. But you know, during the 1880s there was a real surge in anti-Chinese feeling and a heightened sense of discrimination. It was driven by a number of individuals who really had an antipathy towards the Chinese, including the Magnus family. The irony of history, of course, is that now, long after all those people have died, they lie together in the cemetery at one in death.
These physical attacks may have been rare, but they added to an already delicate state of mind for many Chinese miners. For them, the mental anguish of being lonely and far from home was always the toughest thing to deal with.
The challenges that they faced in leaving their home, going to a place that they knew nothing about, to a language that they didn't know, not knowing whether they were ever going to come back, not being able to communicate. There was no email, there was no telephones, there was no aeroplanes, etc. It was a sailing ship they were on. And the only memory that they've got of their mother, their wife, their children, and the memories, and then perhaps if somebody had been over and come back to be able to say, yeah, look, I saw your mother, she said hello to me, and that's all you've got to cling to, somebody's word. And you know, I think, geez, how brave were all those of that generation? Or how desperate were they to leave and go somewhere where they had no idea what it is they were going to face?
The treatment of the Chinese, especially during the 1880s, remains one of the darkest chapters in New Zealand history.